the slides. So if you could bring up these first before you bring up your presentation, I'd be much obliged.
So, okay.
Because I just emailed them to you. So.
Oh, and I was at ice skating.
Yes, you were.
Until just now.
Yep, and I forgot about that, and I was like, oh crap, I should have jumped.
All right, hi everybody. How are you guys doing? Good, good. Welcome to the Wildlife Society meeting for the night. Tonight's, again, another special night. We're going to be having our second seminar in the Daniel O. Trainer Seminar Series. This seminar series is meant to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the student chapter of the Wildlife Society. So it's been a great 50 years, and we hope to continue on these traditions in the future. Like I said, this is the second one. 2 weeks ago, we had a presentation by Dr. Eric Anderson, and these happen every other Tuesday, so not next week, but the following week we'll have Tammy Ryan, who is the Wildlife Health Program Chief for the Wisconsin DNR, come and talk to us. And then on November 9th, we'll have Kurt Verkoteren, who is the Supervisory Research Wildlife Biologist for the APHIS Wildlife Services. So these are some great presentations, and we hope to see you guys all there. So enjoy the presentation.
Hi. So I'm Jennifer Summers. I'm with Wisconsin Center for Wildlife, and I am here because I helped to coordinate this seminar series. And first, I just wanted to go through some acknowledgments. I'd like to thank Brylan, first of all, for helping us with put this together. She's been very helpful and was really great in offering this time slot to offer these really awesome presentations for you guys. I'd also like to thank Scott Hingstrom, who, of course, some of you know, he's the director of Wisconsin Center for Wildlife and an instructor here, and he helped put this together as well. And then, so now anytime we have a public gathering where the public is invited or can come, we always have this acknowledgement where we recognize the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point occupies lands of the Ho-Chunk and Menominee people. Please take a moment to acknowledge and honor the ancestral Ho-Chunk and Menominee land and the sacred land of all indigenous peoples. So now, while this seminar series is celebrating TWS specifically, you know, the student chapter of TWS, this is part of a now annual tradition where we started last year with a seminar series that honors our first dean of the College of Natural Resources, Daniel O. Trainer. And of course, Daniel O. Trainer is the namesake for this building. He was the first dean of the College of Natural Resources, and he was a internationally renowned expert in wildlife health and diseases. And so our first seminar series with Daniel O. Trainer was about all wildlife health and disease. But this year we're focusing obviously on TWS. And I think that he would be pretty proud of that because he was instrumental in guiding new generations of wildlife professionals. I hear he was a really great guy, excellent professor. He was also involved in, he was sat on the Natural Resources Board for a couple of years in the 80s. So I think that he'd be pretty happy to see this happening today. So finally, so now, I'd like to thank you again all for coming and like to introduce our speaker tonight. So of course, I think many of you already know Dr. Shelli Dubay. And Dr. Dubay has been faculty here at UW-SP since 2005, so we won't count how many years that is. But so she's been here for quite a while, and she advises two of the wildlife projects, or the projects here at TWS, a squirrel and
Squirrel.
Thank you.
The bobcat too. They've adopted me in the bobcat.
All right, and now. And so some of you probably know Shelli specializes in wildlife diseases, also captive wildlife management. So if you're a captive wildlife miner, you're going to be talking a lot to her. And I really appreciate that Shelli is a small mammal sympathizer because I felt like when I was involved in the squirrel project years back when I was an undergrad, we're like, she's one of the only people that takes us seriously. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce Dr. Shelli Dubay.
If I can figure out how to get my talk up. Here we go. All right, so I need to clip this on, right? Yes, please. All right. Following directions, not my strong suit. Don't want to forget about the mussel project. I oversee that. The mussel project is a hard one because, you know, it's mussels, there's that. But also because of my lack of experience. But I also co-advise that with Catherine Clancy, who is an absolutely wonderful friend of mine who started at the same time I started in 2005. So it has been a really rewarding experience, even though it's not my expertise by any means. Couple of things. The first thing is that every day when I walk into the Daniel O. Trainer College of Natural Resources building, I'm reminded, of course, that he was a wildlife health expert. And I was reading his articles when I was a master's student. So how lucky am I, right, to be able to walk into a building named after one of the people that I admire as much as I do. Didn't know I was going to be so fortunate. Didn't know I was going to be so fortunate for so many reasons to get the job that I have now. And Dr. Bell was the first person to hire me back in 2000 after I finished my Ph.D. I was 28 years old. Didn't know what I was going to do or how I was going to do it, but he believed in me to have the, I guess, the foresight to know that I would fit in here. What's that?
You proved me right.
And I have had just, I can't even tell you how many triumphs, personal and professional, that I've had because I've been here working with you guys, and I'm so fortunate. So I'm going to talk today about why working with TWS is a mutualism and not a parasitism, even though parasites are my favorite. I do thoroughly enjoy working with TWS for a variety of reasons, including the people that I get to work with. Here we are, Gray Squirrel Project, and then also some activities that we get to do. So let's talk about what a parasitism is or a mutualism, right? So I know this is boring stuff. This is like we're back in our general biology class. But, you know, a mutualism is a symbiosis where two organisms are in close proximity and close association with one another, where the participating species, I'm not thinking that we're species, like I'm thinking it's faculty, like Jason and me and Katie, and the students, and that's like not a parasitism, it's a mutualism. It's mutually beneficial for both parties, the students and for the faculty, and I'm just, hopefully Jason doesn't get too mad at me for speaking for us in terms of the faculty, but I'm using him as an example, of course, as well in my talk. So it's a symbiosis where both parties benefit, right? That's for sure. Instead of a parasitism, like this Channel Island fox that has a tick on its ear. And this isn't my only parasite picture that you're going to see today, of course. I can't help it. Where one organism is benefiting and the other one is being penalized, right? So that's certainly not the case. TWS is a mutualism, like the oxpeckers and the zebra, where the zebra benefits because the oxpeckers are taking the parasites off, and the oxpeckers are benefiting because they're getting some food out of this whole business, right? So I'm going to talk about why TWS, I feel, is beneficial for me. And then, because I have my ideas about why it's beneficial for you guys, I contacted 3 former students and asked them a series of questions, because it's easier for me to talk about them than to talk about myself. And so I'll tell you their stories about how TWS has been helpful for them over their years. I wrote this PowerPoint last week. Dr. Riddle will vouch for me that I did not just do this today. However, I just an hour ago was on the phone with Jake Sherba. And he just called me to tell me he accepted a Ph.D. position at Auburn and was so excited about it. And I said, dude, I'm just going to talk about you in an hour. And I have him on here because of how rewarding our work is. And so I said, hey, what does Rick Kaminsky think when he called? He's like, I just accepted the Ph.D. program or project in Auburn. And I said, oh my God, that is exactly the one you wanted. And he said, yeah. And I said, well, what did Rick have to say about it? And he's like, I'm calling Rick next. I called you first. And I was just like, oh my God, thank you so much. I can go into my talk with a revived, excitement about you and about our students. So one of the things is that it keeps me young-ish. Like I'm not gonna Benjamin Button up in here as much as I would like to go backward. My child keeps me young too, but you all do the same. And it's been really, really rewarding, of course, to see you all. I mean, as much as we hate to see you graduate, right? I mean, that's terrible. That day is great, and it's terrible because you all are going somewhere else, And that's the goal. We want you to graduate and go do great things for wildlife, but it means that we're not going to have that interaction with you unless you call and say, hey, I've got into that master's program or that PhD program that I've been wanting. So super rewarding, but it also, for me, the teamwork aspect is critical. Not just you all working together on projects, but it's helped me to be a better manager. If anyone's been to my office lately, you know that organization is not my strong suit. This is no mystery. However, it helps me to be a better communicator and a better manager so that when I sit down with my research team, I can better dictate the meetings or, help you all to solve problems. And working on these projects with you guys is super rewarding. Now, that being said, many of you who are co-leaders with projects, you're the ones who are advertising for new co-leaders and hiring them and going through that whole process, which is extremely valuable, and I'll talk about that again later. So I don't want you to think for a second that I really have any say in what goes on in some of these projects. I just am almost like a dispatcher. Like I know who's going where, and then when we're back from the field, oh, thank God. How many squirrels did you catch, Another thing that, besides helping me with research, this helps get my research done and helps me learn new skills. So how often is it when a student will come to me with a new idea or a new way to answer a question? This happens all the time, constantly. And I'll give you an example of this in a little while. It keeps me recent, it keeps me current, it keeps me understanding what is happening in our field. You guys go to the literature and bring back hypotheses, and I'll say, well, tell me where you found that hypothesis, and then, well, here's the article, or like the work Melinda's doing right now with us at rehab centers, and I'm just learning a lot about non-trauma neurological intakes for rehab centers, and I'm keeping current, right? Getting some new skills. Keep my job. In order to become tenured and promoted, we need to do three things. We need to do service, we need to do scholarship or research, and we need to teach, right? Those are the three things that we're graded on. And one way for us to stay current and get our research done when we're in the classroom so often is by working with our undergrad teams. And so, I consider keeping my job to be very important because I have the best job in the world. And so being able to work collaboratively with TWS in order to get some of these things accomplished is really important. Collaborate with faculty. Here is my tribe, right? And Eric. So I was really, really frustrated when I realized I have to follow Eric. And you guys saw him 2 weeks ago, and now you know why, right? He's the most dynamic dude, and he's the reason that I wanted to work here, was I wanted to be Eric Anderson, right? Who doesn't want to be Eric Anderson, going out and looking for mountain lions and, all that stuff? Everybody wants to be Eric Anderson. Plus, if you get to know him, he's the nicest guy. He was my mentor for years. So here we are doing flying squirrel stuff. My hair is significantly less gray, and he has more hair now, or more hair then than he does now. But it was because of him and collaborating with faculty that we have the best group. I mean, it is just, I count my lucky stars every day that I get to work with these faculty and you students and work towards a common goal of figuring out ways to better deliver material to you, to empower you to become the best wildlife managers and wildlife biologists that you can be. And it's really nice when everyone you work with is single-mindedly focused on the same thing, right? It's really, really nice. So that's just a little bit about what I get out of it. So what do students get out of it? And I would ask each one of you, and you would each have something different to say. But one of the things that I have learned in my research over the last couple of weeks is that one of the biggest benefits of TWS is we have lifelong friends. And so I'm going to talk about Phil here in a minute, but Phil and Luke are still best friends to this day, and they met at TWS. Phil's getting married this summer, and Luke is his best man. And same thing here. Look at this cast of characters up here, Jason. You've got Anna and Tara and Sarah and Rachel. And she was just married last month, and this picture was stolen. I will fully acknowledge that I stole it. In order to prove my point, that, and I think from what I heard that Sarah might be listening in, live streaming. Hi, Sarah, if you are. And there you are. It's like I knew what I was doing. And so this isn't just something academic or about your career. This is something fundamental to who we all are. You know, these are formative relationships that are built here, partly because you found your tribe, right? You found your group of like-minded humans. And I can only hope that in 20 years when someone else is giving a talk like this, they'll be using pictures of you guys and 10 years on from your careers here. And you guys have to work together to accomplish whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish. Research projects, it might be putting on leadership workshops that Dr. Hingstrom helps you all with, and Dr. Riddle. You work as a team to accomplish a goal, and it's a lot easier if you have your tribe, right? You found the people of like-minded interest. Leadership skills, and I give a lot of references. Last time I counted, I had 530 individual folders on my computer for individual students where I've written letters or done something like that. And almost every single one of them asks about leadership. What, the reference check might be, give me an example of how so-and-so had to serve as a leadership role, or conflict resolution, and I say, oh, well, they had to live together for 6 weeks at Tree Haven. That's conflict resolution. So leadership is really important. And so, running for office, or in this case, the TWS chapter of the year, North Central Section awards, those are putting you in a leadership role. Not to mention you're meeting people when you're at these meetings. And Jason, isn't it every third year our representative is on the state TWS board, right? So, so that is critically important in terms of leadership building, that you can say that you are on the board of a state chapter of TWS, not just the student chapter, the state chapter. So building leadership qualities are critically important. Maintaining some connections, and by this I initially thought connections with faculty, that TWS brings, with me being the advisor for a few projects, Jason's advisor, Dr. Sartini, Dr. Perkins, we all are advisors for these projects. But I got to thinking too about this joker here, Brad Strobel and Mark Foss. So it's not just connections with your faculty, it's connections with professionals. And I was reading again Catherine's response, Catherine Brackle, who I'll talk about in a second. And she said, our graduates are everywhere. We are all over. So I was asking her about her friend group, and she's like, we've all graduated, and we're all over the United States, And I was like, wow, the connections that you can make with our alumni, in addition to faculty and in addition to professionals in the field, kind of all start here with TWS, right? So Noah spent some of his summer in Alaska with Travis Booms. And Travis was a former TWS president. And he then wrote an article for the article that Joe Quell and others wrote in the Wildlife Professional about our chapter and how we have been so successful. And Travis wrote a little follow-up article about how his experiences in our student chapter of TWS have helped formulate his career. But it's those connections of TWS, a current vice president and a former president of our chapter here, can find each other easier because there's always that commonality, and then you end up going and doing something super cool for part of your summer, right? So these connections and gaining some kind of experience, and it doesn't have to be research, even though that's like my most common connection with TWS. But it can be, adopt a wildlife area and learning how to use chainsaws, or doing your leadership workshops, or doing education programs like Kaylee's doing here. She's now the head educator at a rehab center in Illinois. And so research is part of it, right? And I have a whole bunch of examples of research projects, and you all are involved in these as well. But connections with faculty, you've got opportunities to present at research symposia or at national or regional TWS meetings, the Midwest Fish and Wildlife Conference. Research is not just the process of doing it, which is obviously very critically important, and testing hypotheses and coming up with experimental design, going back to Wildlife 311 that Dr. Riddle teaches. It's critically important. But while you're going through that process, you're also figuring out things about yourself. What do you want to do? How do you want to make your difference? Are you interested in research? Or are you interested in management? Maybe you want to be the one that's doing brush removal or burning. A former student of mine is involved in Massasauga rattlesnake work in Michigan and doing burning for Massasauga rattlesnakes. Is that how you want to make your difference? And going through these processes allows you to kind of come up with that. What really makes me tick? It's hard because we like everything always, seems like, but sooner or later you kind of land on how you're going to be happiest. And that's one of the other things that were very rewarding for us, is helping you to figure that out about yourselves. So I just picked 3 students that I think he'll illustrate this really well. I came up with my hypotheses, as a scientist will, of how TWS helps students. And then I use these 3 to test my hypotheses, kind of like, all right, so here's what I think TWS does. You all tell me what it did for you. And so we'll talk about Phil and Matt. They were both involved with a weasel parasite project, and Catherine, who was involved with the gray squirrel project previously. So here's Matt. He's now a Ph.D. student at Texas Tech. He did his master's degree at Western Kentucky on Lyme disease and small mammal and tick ecology. And he's now, even though you'd think he was studying cranes, he's not. This was a side project that he got to do in Oregon, but he's at Texas Tech studying axis deer. They're just free-ranging in Texas, okay? And nobody knows anything about them because they're not native, but they are running amok. And so he is looking at how chronic wasting disease transmission will be affected by all these axis deer in addition to white-tailed deer on the landscape. And so I'll come back to him in a second. And Phil is a natural heritage biologist with Illinois DNR. He finished his master's in 2013 on lesser prairie chickens, also at Texas Tech, ironically. There was no connection there, even though they were on the same project as undergrads here. And here he is with a skinned weasel. You know, the things that you dig up from your files when you're looking for something. I was like, this is going to take me forever to find an old picture of Phil. And I was like, oh, well, there he is, with a skinned weasel even. Perfect. And then he sent me these from his master's work. So I asked them, you know, a little bit about TWS, and we'll get to that after my really cool pictures of parasites. I know. This is an ermine, and they get these parasites called Scrubingalis nasicola, which has more consonants all jammed together than you would ever expect to see in one word. So we started this project in, he graduated in 2011, so it must have been like in 2010 or 2009. And these parasites are up in the brain case, all the way, they're nasal parasites, but we were initially looking here for them and not finding anything. Oh, well, you have to go all the way up here, and in specimens in collections, skull collections, these parasites have done such a number on the skull that in some species they're actually disfigured the skull. There's so many parasites up there that you can tell by going to museum collections who was affected and who wasn't, because the brain case is deformed in these areas. Okay, so we were like, well, that's interesting. I wonder what we can learn about that. And we ended up getting these weasels from trappers and worked with the Wisconsin Trappers Association, which was an absolute delight. They were just so excited to be able to donate the carcasses of the animals that they cared about. And the DNR manages all weasels together, even though there's 3 species in our state, and they manage them all together. And guess what? They're not that hard, or they're not that easy to identify when they don't have their skins on. So we would get a bunch of bags of skinless weasels and not know what in the world was in there. And so our job was to A, identify what in the hell it was, and B, see what kind of parasites they have in there and in the lung. So this is the heart. Here's the trachea. And here's a little bag of Philoroides martis cyst on the lungs. Okay, so that was the project. And so we were like, okay, well, knowing what we know about parasites, we would expect males to be more heavily infected than females. We would expect maybe body condition to be affected by all these giant cysts on the lungs. And the one thing, this is my new skill, was identifying weasels by the baculum. So I said, well, how in the hell are we going to tell the short-tailed from the long-tailed weasels when you have skinned weasels? And they have such dramatic overlap in body size. You look at the penis bone, by Jove. And that's what Phil and Luke said, I think we can use this. And I said, well, okay, well, that's about half of them, right? What are we going to do with the females? Sure enough, they're a hell of a lot harder. What we ended up figuring out was that there were some cranial characteristics that you could look at in addition to weight. And the females breed so early that every weasel that we would get would be considered an adult. So at least we had that going for us. But we were really looking at ermine. Most of the animals that were trapped were ermine. And so what did we find? I'll just go through this quickly. Prevalence of this nasal parasite was almost 98%. Almost everybody had it, which was pretty amazing. And some of them had 56 worms in their brain case. Crazy, huh? And males, of course, had a higher intensity than females, which is what we had anticipated. And the same thing for Philoroides martis. Males had higher intensities than females, which is very typical in parasite world. Males are more heavily parasitized because they have testosterone, which decreases the immune system, and they also have larger home ranges, and there's lots of reasons why males are more heavily infected. And so this went along with our hypothesis, but it also varied with year. So our first year was 2008, and it ended in 2012. And what we found was the average intensity of Scrubingalis varied by year, but the pattern did not change with year. So it wasn't like 2018 males were higher than females, or females were higher than males, and then it changed, with year. They kind of mirrored each other, and it was also extremely dependent upon rainfall. So what was kind of dictating the ups and downs here was rainfall the previous year. Well, what all of this has done for us, what I would say Phil and Matt and myself, is we published this manuscript in 2014, and Matt was instrumental in writing it and doing the analysis. And he was told by his master's advisor that the reason that he was placed on the short list right out of the gate was because he had a manuscript in review. So it was critically important that this project get done for him to get into his master's project, and it was parasite based. But also, this is the time when I was going from associate professor to full professor, and this really was very important in that process for me as well. So definitely a mutualism. And here are Luke and Phil, and Todd Huspany, who was the former parasitologist before Dr. Orlovsky was hired. Todd's now over in Old Main. So a lot of undergrads were instrumental in getting this project done. So when I asked Matt about this, I said, how did TWS help your career and generally in your life? And he said, well, I wouldn't have gotten my master's without the research experience that I'd gained there. He's like, his master's professor straight up told him the reason that you were selected as one of the top 2 for interview is because you had a manuscript that you were working on. But also, he said that one of the critical things that he learned from being with TWS is how to interact with people and landowners specifically. So now he's living in a state where 98% of the land is private. So anywhere he goes, he needs to gain access to the landowners there, right? And his first experience with this was talking to the trappers and gaining access to the carcasses, to the traps, to the trappers via this project. So interfacing with all of the WTA, writing up reports for them and publishing it in their little newsletter, and the leadership qualities that he gained at that time, he says are critical. I want to, if I can find it quickly, you guys know that I always have 1,000 notes up here, and then I never read any of them, which is vintage me. He says, one last note. Your professors at UW-SP are amazing and will always be willing to help you even long after graduating, and always like to hear what you end up doing. And he says, Dr. Dubay was one of the first people I called after getting offered my Ph.D. position, and we keep in contact at least each semester, which is true. And so I think that's across the board for anyone in in that picture, whether it's Dr. Yankee or Dr. Sartini. It is connections with faculty that are going to get you the letters of recommendation or the reference calls or any of those kinds of things. And TWS is a remarkable conduit for that. Here are Luke and Phil, like they're attached at the hip, capturing lesser prairie chickens. Luke was able to be Phil's field technician when he got into his graduate work. And he's like, oh man, I mean, these are my lifelong friends. He's going to be my best man at my wedding. The research was critical. We just featured him maybe late last semester, maybe, I don't know, the CNR does an alumni feature on Facebook, and he was just featured and was basically said the same thing, that having the connections and expertise to know who to ask. So he's now a natural heritage biologist, and he's got to manage for all of the T&E species in these counties down in Illinois. And so he's got this network of people that he can ask for about so I hear that you're trapping, Preble's jumping mouse or whatever, and can get his connections are broad, partly because of being in TWS. This is them at a conference. Oh gosh. 2010 probably was my best guess. So the next person I want to highlight is Catherine Moritz. Now it's Catherine Brackle. She's a soil conservationist at the NRCS, and she was a former TWS president. And she was a real go-getter, but what really strikes me about Catherine is that she was extraordinarily shy. And she is no longer shy, partly because of getting up in front of the TWS group every week as a president and expressing what she needed to. And she's like, I really ended up eventually becoming very comfortable in that role. She did her master's on the effects of oil and gas development on white-tailed deer in North Dakota and South Dakota. She worked with a guy named John Jenks, who was from South Dakota State, where she did her master's. He is, one of the most prolific ungulate ecologists over the last probably 30 years. And here they are at a conference, Christina and Catherine presenting their gray squirrel research. And so this was back when the Gray Squirrel Project was at Sandhill. So my gray squirrel kids, this is prior to the Schmeekley trapping that we do now because of Dan. So, and that's a good thing. I'm not like, I'm not blaming you. That's a good thing. So the question was, how does timber harvest affect squirrel trapping? And there were 3 different stands that were of different ages, and they were looking at how they could trap squirrels in these 3 different stands. And much like the current gray squirrel team, these guys had to revamp their entire project for a variety of reasons, some of which had to do with Sandhill. And one part of Sandhill was hunted and one part wasn't, so there was a few extra factors to keep in mind here. So here's the mature stand. This is where you would expect squirrels to be, right? We don't all need to be on the Gray Squirrel Project to know that. Here was the intermediate stand, and here was the young stand, right? Like we would expect there to be fewer squirrels here. And sure enough, with Dr. Riddle's help, of course, everything happens with Jason, especially when you see this nonsense, right? You're like, oh, this has got Riddle written all over it. Because there's something called a delta AIC, and then the word occupancy is in here. So this is a Riddle thing, and absolutely, he and I co-advised, thank goodness, because there's no way this is coming out of my computer. We co-advised Catherine and Christina. I would say rather effectively. Would you say, Jason? So as you guys know, here's the model that's saying that gray squirrel occupancy varied with stand, and the likelihood of detecting them varied with stand. So we have the mature stand was the one where we had occupancy, which is exactly what we had expected. But, at the time, and this was probably 2012, she graduated in 2013, an undergrad doing occupancy modeling was pretty darn popular in terms of getting into graduate school, right? So, and coming up with the idea, which I did not come up with and Jason did not come up with. He does come up with these kinds of ideas all the time, but we let them decide. What do you want to study? Sandhill, what is interesting to you? And they said, you know, I think that there are going to be differences in trappability and occupancy by where our traps are set up. And we're like, all right, well, let's figure out how to answer that question, you know? And so here, this is another student, Lynora, who actually did her master's on plague in, I think, South Dakota. And so with Catherine, lifelong friends, doing research connections, it's like she hits on all of these. And one of the most impressive parts about her work now is that she works with ranchers and farmers to better manage their lands for wildlife, and has to interface with landowners all the time as an NRCS professional. And she said, you know, I really wouldn't have ran for president of TWS if my friends wouldn't have put my name in the jar or whatever. You know, she's like, they did this. And then I win, you know. And she's like, and I actually ended up getting pretty comfortable in the role over time. First couple times getting up in front of, you know, 150 students is pretty terrifying. But she said that has no doubt prepared me for interacting with the public like I do now and having the confidence to do that on a daily basis. So with that, I would say, you know, we are so lucky to have each other, you know, in terms of TWS, in terms of projects, and in terms of faculty. And of course, I need to thank Phil, Matt, and Catherine for answering my questions and helping me test hypotheses. My tribe, which is, you know, faculty, and then of course my child, who is here, I have to thank my child, who's not even paying attention, which is typical, and that's the normal way our life goes. And then of course, you all, for providing us the opportunity to get our research done and to have interpersonal relationships with young people that keep us young, for sure. So with that, I don't know if there's any questions, but I'm happy to talk more about how great you are, if that's what we need to do. Or if Jason has anything to add about your experience with TWS, because he's obviously been our fearless leader, faculty-wise, since Dr. Anderson retired. So.
No, you nailed it. The people in the room are great, and we are super lucky and blessed to have an opportunity to be part of their lives, their careers.
And keep track of them after they leave here. You know, it's so rewarding to get that phone call or a text message, you know, hey, I'm interviewing next week at this place, or and I'm like, oh my gosh, you know, who are you interviewing with? Do I need to make a phone call? Like, how much do I need to mother hen this? You know, not very much, usually, because that's how they've gotten to where they already are, you know. But it's been great. And we're, you know, with you all, even just the experiences of whether it's in wildlife techniques class and going through all the research projects, you know, quickly. I didn't like doing it nearly as much on Zoom as we now can with, and I teach techniques again next semester. That's super rewarding too, because then you end up individually working on research projects with students. So, any comments or questions or? All right, and I actually got done in the right amount of time. Can you dig it? Thank you. Next week we'll have
Brad Strobel and a few of his friends.
Obviously.
Project. He's going to come in and talk about his experiences with TWS, and
He's a rapscallion.
I hear it's going to be a good presentation, so make sure you show up for that. Otherwise, do you have any comment? Yep.
Before I forget,
The loves of my life.
Wisconsin Center for Wildlife, and we have a first aid CPR training happening tomorrow. It's $90, and which is a discount from what the American Red Cross normally charges. So if you haven't signed up, please do. Please consider signing up for this. It's a really good thing to have on your resume. It's really good, just good thing to have in general, because you never know when you're going to be able to save a life. So consider signing up. If you need the information, come talk to me. Okay.
All right, thanks,
Shelli.
guys.